Introducing the right-wing war on education, starring Betsy DeVos, evangelical Christians, and a few dudes who rented out strip malls, called themselves schools, and stole your public school tax dollars.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
In this hour, we'll talk about how Republicans want to dumb our kids down and what we have to do to stop them. As always, leading the conversation is Patti Vasquez. But with her, we have Kirk Bangstead of the Minocqua Brewing Company, who is leading the charge to get rid of the parasitic voucher school system in Wisconsin. And a few fellow public education warriors he brought along to educate us. The right-wing war on education is brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company. Take it away, Patti.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us for our weekly segment on the right-wing war on public education. We've been doing this for several weeks, and I want to thank Kirk Bangstead because you, Minocqua Brewing Company, have really shared a lot of important information to our listeners. So let's remind them of where this came from, why you're so dedicated to this entire cause. Go ahead. A little bit of a review.
Okay, so we filed a lawsuit, or the Minocqua Brewing Company Super PAC funded a lawsuit to try to overturn the parasitic voucher school system in Wisconsin. We also are trying to get rid of revenue limits, which are part of that funding system that really attacks and kind of takes money away from public schools. But if we're going to sue in the Supreme Court, and we might take away thousands of vouchers for kids to get into private schools. Some people might think that's dangerous or bad, and it's absolutely not. And so part and parcel of our lawsuit is explaining why the parasitic voucher system is bad for public schools. It's bad for every kid in Wisconsin, and we've attacked it from every angle. I mean, we've talked about the history being steeped in Brown versus Board of Education, which is steeped in kind of racist measures. We talked about disabilities. Kids with disabilities don't get a fair shake in voucher systems. LGBTQ kids can get kicked out. There's no accountability in these private schools, whereas in public schools you have school boards. You have a host of ways where tax dollars can be kind of regulated and made sure that they're being spent correctly. So we've hit it a bunch of different ways. This is the last show of our series, and we're going to talk about race today, specifically because we were attacked. Dr. Julie Underwood, I and my legal team were attacked by the American Federation for Children, which is a Betsy DeVos-backed school choice lobby, through one of their fellows, who was a young woman who was going to college. She was a Latin woman of color who was writing as a fellow for Betsy DeVos's group, and she attacked us for trying to take away her opportunities, which we responded, congratulations for getting a wonderful educational opportunity, but there's so many other kids who are not getting that because they're being deprived of dollars in public schools. So this show, we wanted to address that issue. It's our last show, and it's probably the most important issue in this voucher school area is race, and especially because obviously I'm a white guy from rural Wisconsin, and so is Julie. So it's hard for us, and I don't have that history. But so we invited some guests who have done a lot of research in this area, and I wanted to introduce our first one now. Patti, are we able to do that?
I think we can do that. I would love to introduce our guests that you have invited to the show. And this is so important because this is what people say, well, you don't like children of color. Why do you want to take away these opportunities? And it's bull hockey. That's the best way I can.
Bull pucky. We can say that on the radio. So our guest, we have a great guest. We have two guests today, and we have a third segment where we're going to wrap up the entire season. But Dountonia Batts is our first guest for this week. I did it right. I checked ahead of time. I want to make sure I got your name right, Dountonia. So she's from Indiana, and Miss Batts is on the board of the Network for Public Education Action, which is a national advocacy group for public schools. And then within Indiana, she works for Public Voices for Public Schools. She has a law degree and was formerly a high school English teacher. So first question for you, Dountonia. Tell us about the voucher school environment in Indiana.
Well, in Indiana, we have a near universal voucher system. And up until recently, about 90% of the state dollars that would go to local public schools are now going toward tuition, to fund the tuition of private school educators. Now, what might surprise you is the income limits that will allow one to get a voucher. Sorry. So previously, the income limit was 300% of the was the threshold. 300% of roughly $154,000 for a family of four would be eligible for a voucher. Now it is 400%. And the cutoff to qualify for free and reduced lunch, which is a common indicator of financial need. Now a family of four who earns about $220,000 a year is now eligible. Now, what does that mean? That means that students who are currently enrolled in private schools and their parents were paying for their education, which is totally their right to pay for a private school education, are now eligible to take state dollars to supplement or subsidize, or as I call it, take state-funded welfare for the wealthy. And under the guise of saying that we're providing opportunities for people of color. These were students who were already in private education, paying for it, and now taking away public dollars in order to subsidize their education. Now, how does that help students of color?
Right. Yeah. How? Basically rewarding the wealthy for being wealthy and contributing to more wealth. It's insane. And I understand that you have experience with voucher schools. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I was the poster child for private education, or for vouchers, I'm sorry. My students, I have four boys, and we were in private schools. I made a conscious decision to educate my students privately. I had a very good public school education, but as the result of a divorce, I wanted my children to have a very specific worldview, which was a biblical worldview in every aspect of their lives. And it wasn't until the younger two entered school and we started to have issues. Actually, my oldest child wanted to become an engineer. However, the school wasn't willing, when I sat down with the school counselor, to help provide or direct us in areas of extracurriculars for STEM education, et cetera. They were just limited in what they could offer academically for my son. Then, so I took him out and put him in the program that I graduated from, which was a magnet school in one of the biggest public high schools in our city. But it was my youngest child where the issues really started to happen. He thinks differently. He's a genius, but wasn't because of the interactions with the teachers he had a teacher who had never had children. And apparently she had a specific idea of what a Black student from a single home was like, and projected that onto my son, where he felt that he was not smart. He was constantly being picked on in the classroom. I remember one time he wrote an essay about what he wanted for Christmas, and he said he's very picky eater and he wanted food. And I declare she wanted to call CPS on me because she thought that I was not feeding my children. And this was after 3 times going back and forth to the school, letting them know that we don't need any money, or he's not hungry. But when they were about to flunk my son, I took him out and homeschooled him because I needed to reboost his self-esteem. And now he's thriving and doing well. But my point is that experience really opened my eyes to the lack of resources that were provided to my students. And also they were being deprived of a holistic view of who they are. It was from a very narrow perspective. And I didn't want that for my sons. And so I took them out and put them in in public schools. I declare, I am like, I got this private school on my mind.
So thank you for that personal story. So it's great to understand that you were in both sides of this kind of debate, and you chose public schools to enable your children to get a broader education. Now the question is this, though. You chose at first to send your kids because you wanted to get a biblical worldview. I get that. There's a lot of parents do that. And when we're talking about voucher schools and trying to get rid of them, it's not because we don't want parents to send their kids to private schools that are religious schools. Like, go for it. We just don't want public tax dollars to go to that. But the bigger question is, it is largely, at least in Wisconsin, about 80% of the folks who take school vouchers are taking it, would have gone to religious private schools anyways. And so seemingly the school choice world, the people that are pro school choice, should just say, listen, we want state tax dollars to go send kids to religious schools. But instead they say, we want to provide the parents with a choice. And they also say, we want to be able to lift up kids that are poor and kids of color and get them to a better opportunity. Why do you think they talk about helping kids of color as opposed to just talking about what's really happening, allowing state dollars to pay for religious schools?
Optics. It's a better argument. It's one that would allow, it's an argument that provides mobilization. If you have the majority of Black and brown students who are enrolled in public schools, and there's a massive marketing campaign to create a negative view of public schools, every person, every parent, I would say, I argue, wants the best for their child. There is no way that whatever color you are, you will continue to send your child to a school that is labeled as failing. And it's not, and if you look at the demographics side by side, private schools do not perform better than public schools. And as a matter of fact, public schools do a better job at educating students than the private school students, because private schools get to cherry pick or select the elite among all of all students to educate them. So if we're looking at honor student to honor student, they're probably doing about the best. They're doing best. They're doing about equal, if not better, public education. But if you look at the totality of the demographics of the students that public schools must educate, those with disabilities, those from impoverished areas, those who don't speak English, honor students, there's a combination of all of that. You can argue that public schools do a better job at educating students. Now, there's a couple of arguments here that say some of the reason why this movement is, why you would market and say that we can't say that we want to provide fund religious education, because it doesn't sound good, the separation of church and state, if people remember what that means. But also at the heart of it, two benign arguments are that privatization undermines teacher unions. It's a base support. It's a base support for the Democratic Party, and there were, to gut the Democratic Party. That's one way. Let's privatize education or privatize everything. But then again, privatization rhetoric also talks about wooing African Americans and Latinos under the guise of equity to bolster this argument. It sounds better, but the bottom line is it's not about helping our Black and brown students, especially if you're not the ideal student, the one that fits into the culture of what the private school wants. There's a system of workers. If you look at the state pathways in Indiana, we're creating workers and not thinkers. So, it's a sinister thing, and it's not designed for all Black and brown students. Yes, there are Black and brown students who are benefiting and doing well, but the majority of Black and brown students don't get chosen to be in the private school of their choice.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and that the way in which it's really not about choice? Because that's what's promoted, what people say over and over, you don't believe in choice, when you just mentioned that the schools actually get to choose and cherry pick their students.
Absolutely. Well, the whole premise behind private education is that it is for the elite, the best, because you pay for it, right? Well, who here can go to Notre Dame and say, hey, I want to be a part of your school? I'm choosing you, Notre Dame. No, they have a criteria of the kind of student that they want at Notre Dame. Hence, I can't go to any K through 12 private school and say, I choose you. Okay, maybe for the first 3 months I don't know how it works in Wisconsin, but maybe until the count day, the ADM count day, where they determine how many students you have enrolled on a particular day. And based on that number of enrollment, that's how much you get funded. Okay, we'll let you in for the first 3 months or however weeks it is in order to get the state funds, but we'll gingerly exit you out the back door. And so you cannot really choose a private school. The schools still choose you. And I must say that we've always had a choice to attend a private school. Always. You have always had choice.
So let me go back, and I think we've got about a minute left here. Let me go back to something you said earlier. Optics. So, if the public schools are primarily, full of, kids of color, and then there's a marketing campaign that says that these schools are bad, that's kind of saying they're bad because they're full of kids with color. And if they're saying that to parents of kids of color, then they're convincing those parents that they got to put their kids into private schools with less kids of color, in order to get a better education. That seems really like sinisterly kind of underhandedly racist kind of as well. I mean, am I reading what you said correctly?
You are reading what I say correctly. By labeling a school failing, or bad, you in turn associate that with those who attend that school. I'm bad. I'm not. I remember teaching at a school and a student saying, our school is trash. Why is our school, and trying to say, you go to this school, you have pride, you're bright. There's nothing trash about this school, and there's nothing trash about you. And, schools are made up of people, and so we can make those associations. And unfortunately, our students are making those associations and coming out thinking negatively about themselves and their ability, when I have seen some of the most brilliant minds and some of the most most depressing or quote unquote labeled underperforming classrooms that you would ever want to imagine. The difference is resources. The difference is raising the standard and not lowering the standard. Going to a school that doesn't give out D's and F's is not raising the standard for our students. Because I believe that you really cannot talk about private school vouchers without also talking about charters, because charters are also, the whole point of this is to dismantle public education as we know it. Ever since Brown v. Board, there's been an effort, a collaborative effort by the wealthy of this nation to undermine, to defund, and to eliminate public education. And the root of that is racist in its to the core. And it's unfortunate that we are going to destroy the fabric of our country.
Yep.
Because we don't want we don't want to create a nation of thinkers who, regardless of what you look like, can be educated together and to change this country into what it was. I can't say what it was originally meant to be, because this is what it was originally meant to be. But the ideal is that the inclusivity of what it was originally meant to be.
I cannot thank you enough for your expertise and for sharing your personal story. Dountonia, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
You as well. We're going to take a quick break here, and we come back. We're going to introduce our next guest, Dr. Preston Green, in a moment on WCPT 820 Heartland Signal and KTNF 950 AM.
Won't you let me die? And now back to the right-wing war on education.
And we are continuing our conversations sponsored by the Monaco Brewing Company and the mighty leader of Monaco Brewing Company, Kirk Bangstead, as we continue to cover the right-wing war on public education. And Kirk, I know you have lined up some great guests tonight. Please introduce us to our next guest.
Sure. So we're talking about race in the voucher school system. Is it really what it's all cracked up to be? A lot of the voucher school advocates, school choice advocates, say that voucher school helps kids of color. We've got Dr. Preston Green here to talk about this issue. Dr. Green is a professor of urban education at the University of Connecticut. His law degree is from Columbia Law School, and his PhD is from Teachers College, Columbia University. He's affiliated with the National Education Policy Center in Boulder, Colorado. His specific area of expertise is exactly this topic, and it's on vouchers and whether they are good for kids in public schools. He has published widely on topics such as discriminatory impacts of vouchers, religion and voucher schools, racial disparities, and segregation within voucher schools. So, Dr. Green, what does the research show in terms of voucher schools having a positive or negative impact for students of color?
Well, first, I want to thank you so much for having me on and to talk about this really important topic. And certainly, we're all watching nationwide to see what Wisconsin does. And so, first of all, before going into the research about vouchers, it's important to understand that vouchers have been, that they are advertised really as an opportunity, that it provides an opportunity for Black and Brown students. In Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, the Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of voucher programs, the Supreme Court actually did talk about how vouchers could provide an opportunity for students of color attending public schools to improve their educational outcomes or get chances by enrolling in voucher programs. But the research hasn't really borne that out. And in fact, in Louisiana, Ohio, Washington, D.C., among others, Louisiana, Ohio, Indiana, and Washington, D.C., where there have been 4 major voucher programs that have been passed, there's been research that has found that those students, urban students or students of color who attend these voucher schools actually lose a great deal, do much more poorly than their traditional public school students on state standardized tests. And in fact, in Louisiana, it was found that a student who was performing in the 50th percentile in a public school went down to the 34th percentile in math in 1 year. So we're talking really major losses. And this was something that I think that voucher folks had not really anticipated. Now in Washington, D.C., there were losses, but they found that they eventually did catch up over time. But the point I want to make here is that we're finding that students are not performing all that well in these programs, and that even when in D.C., where they might have caught up, this is no reason to have an expansive program that is taking funds away from traditional public schools and including urban school districts that are already underfunded.
Dr. Green, why would kids that are going to voucher schools in Louisiana do worse than in the public schools? What is the potential? I mean, it's opposite of what's being marketed to these kids. Why is it happening? Do you have any idea?
Well, there were a lot of discussions about this and a lot of theories. I think that, and I don't think, I think the proponents of voucher programs stated that what had happened was that the top flight voucher schools refused to participate because of the need to, because of the requirement that they had to have state standardized tests. And so what their excuse was that the really good schools were tuned off by the testing requirements and the accountability requirements. But that, of course, is the way that we can actually determine, one of the ways that we can determine how schools are performing and whether or not students are learning.
Is it possible? Sorry. Is it possible that a lot of these schools, I mean, we've heard about pop-up voucher schools in earlier episodes where the average voucher school lasts about 4 years. Is it possible that these schools got all these public money, opened up to be able to collect that public money, but didn't necessarily care about the kids that were going to those schools and then thus by extension, those kids didn't do so well on standardized tests.
It is a possibility. That certainly is a possibility. Again, that the one of the expectations is that students of color are going to go to Choate, they're going to go to Andover, they're going to go to these like wonderful voucher programs, but that isn't the reality for a lot of students. They end up going to some of these pop-up schools or other schools that are just not that well established. So, I mean, that certainly could be a reason for this poor performance for many of these schools.
But Dr. Green, the architects of these programs say this is exactly the kind of school system that will benefit lower income children and children of color. Certainly, they're not lying to us and trying to pull one over on us, are they?
Well, I think that many of them are true believers. I think many of them believe in the market. I mean, they think about this in religious terms. So I do think that certainly there are. I write a lot about scams, and if you look at some of the research that I've done, I talk about scams and funding accountability, but I do think that many folks are true believers, and even with that, I think that it's still hard to argue against the problems that we are seeing, and the sort of like the differences and protections that students of color will have in voucher schools versus traditional public schools. And I wish that they would address these issues head on, which many of them refuse to do.
Is there a particular scam you could highlight, or that have you seen these schools, how badly they use these kids?
Well, I will say that I think your previous person had talked a little bit about this sort of accounting scam where they will like have students in voucher schools on October the 1st and then find ways to remove them later on. So you see things like that, but I always tell people that the one thing to really pay attention to when you start thinking about the sort of scams that you're going to be seeing is what has happened in charter schools, which is another area that I write about. And because of this lack of oversight, we've seen, major examples of real estate fraud. We've seen examples of, I won't go into the legal discussions about related party transactions, but basically shell games where you see money being moved around from different to different little programs where students were actually they were not actually educating students, but were pocketing that money. And this is in charter schools, which are ostensibly public schools, where there's supposed to be oversight. And I always say that, if you see what's happening in charter schools where there's oversight, you will see this exponentially increased if you have if you start expanding voucher programs. So, so of course, like you see this in Florida with the education savings accounts, for instance, with those parents who are, going to Walt Disney, going to use that money to educate students. So, I always joke that you're going to see a lot of reporters getting Pulitzer Prizes following this as they follow the money and see where it goes.
Yeah.
So I have a follow-up and the reason you weren't there earlier when I introduced the show, or maybe you were. The reason I wanted to do this show specifically is because there was the American Federation for Children, which is Betsy DeVos's school choice lobby, had a young student of color who was a fellow for this lobby write about our lawsuit and how. And she said, "Why are you trying to take away opportunities for kids of color? I was a product of a great Catholic school. I wouldn't have been able to go there without a voucher to get there. And look at me now. I'm going to Marquette University." All the things she said were wonderful, and I was like, this is fabulous. But what about all those other kids that don't get that money that you've taken away from the public school system? So the question I have for you is. And I talked to our other earlier guest, Dountonia, about this as well, is the marketing that we're seeing from the school choice lobby is that public schools in urban areas, which are primarily filled with students of color, they're terrible schools. They're failing schools. They get that hammered into them. And then all of a sudden you have parents at these public schools like, thank God they're giving us vouchers to get out of this hellhole, even though they've taken all the money away from the public schools and made it less able to serve students. So isn't it like reverse? If they're saying that public schools filled with kids of color are inherently bad, and the only way you can rescue them is to move them into private schools with less kids of color, isn't that like inherent, like an insidious way to say that like public schools with kids of color are bad? Or it's insidiously racist in some fashion. I don't know.
Well, I'll answer it this way. I can certainly, I will say that when that student talks about like the issues of public schools, I write a lot about school funding issues that students of color face. And I will say that, there certainly is a history of school districts being underfunded. So, I've written a lot about that. And so a lot of the voucher proponents talk about this, and then they say, look at what's happening. There's this bigger, better offer that we can provide for you by enrolling in voucher programs and escaping. What they fail to talk about, though, is that while students go to these schools, their rights don't necessarily follow them. So, so I talk a lot, for instance, I teach, constitutional law in public schools, and students do not necessarily, their constitutional rights don't follow them. And so one right that really does matter that your previous panelists talked about was when students get kicked, when students get drummed out, or, when after they've been admitted, that's in part due to a lack of constitutional due process. And where students who are in public schools have, there's an issue, they have the right to challenge that, and there's a hearing, there's some protections for them. And these students sign their rights away to due process when they go to a voucher program. So one thing that I always tell when I always talk about this is to understand that these rights are important. These are rights that that were fought very hard in constitution, in Supreme Court cases and so on. And you give those up when you go to voucher programs. And so a lot of these stories that you were talking about before are due in part to the lack of protections that students have.
And in Illinois, I believe there are also some of these schools, if a child gets into trouble for violating some code, they can also be fined. That seems like another undue burden on students. Anyway.
Right. They can be fined. They can be fined. There's the practice of counseling out. Julie Mead, as I understand it, who was on before, University of Wisconsin professor, talks about the sorts of ways that students get counseled out, where they say, our program is not a real fit for your student.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, for students of color, this is the sort of thing that can happen very often, is that if you don't fit within that model, then
you're out.
Then they're out, or either they're out, or even if they're let in, then they're drummed out later on.
Yep.
So to me, if we extend, voucher schools in Wisconsin are hugely growing, but in other states like Indiana, we just talked to Dountonia, it's way bigger, and I believe in Arizona it's much bigger. At the end of the day, if so many people are available to take vouchers, if it's 400% of the poverty level, which is like $200,000 income per family, if everyone's taking those vouchers, then all of a sudden you have private schools who can raise their tuitions to just beyond what that voucher state money is. And wouldn't a school that doesn't want to have racial diversity potentially in that private school, they could, in an urban area, could they raise that price so now you'd have two different levels of private schools when the public school is completely washed out. Now you can completely divide on race, LGBTQ, disability. You can divide whatever you want to divide, because now you can't be equal because a public school system doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that the lack of, some of these programs many of these programs do not have restrictions on the pricing of vouchers. And so that scenario can very easily happen. And in addition, so that's certainly a big problem where there's the illusion of choice, where it's like, well, you have this voucher, and then you may not be able to use it. But in addition to that, and I will also add that when you have these programs, they could also have a major impact on urban communities. Again, many of them that are underfunded as it is. This could create a great deal more stress in these schools that are going to be serving the lion's share of students. And so there's that policy matter as well, that these are various issues that need to be thought about by families of color, students of color, when they're thinking about voucher programs. And in addition, so like thinking about protecting their public schools, because it is a very real possibility that they could lose them if a voucher program becomes too large.
Thank you so much, Dr. Preston Green. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And again, I'd also like to connect with you and find a way to amplify these messages and educate folks on what the impacts are of voucher systems. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and thank you. It was great to be on.
Thank you. Have a great evening. And we're going to take a quick break here, and we're going to wrap up when we come back on the Right Wing War on Education on WCPT 820, Heartland Signal, and KTNF 950 AM.
Hi, folks. I'm Kirk Bankstead from the Minocqua Brewing Company, and I sell choice hard seltz and all natural fruit and
Outstanding. Thank you.
That you can enjoy for only 100 calories a can. A percentage of the proceeds of each can sold goes to reproductive rights groups in the Chicagoland area. Enjoy a light, refreshing hard seltzer and support reproductive freedom at the same time.
Have a good one.
Now available in
Thank you.
Chicago and R&J Wine and Spirits in Glenview, as well as Eastside Cafe, Coffee
Stand by.
Bar in East Dundee, where Kate is serving up smiles. And drink responsibly.
And we are back with Kirk Bankstead and Minocqua Brewing Company's Right Wing War on Public Education. Take it home, Kirk. What do you want to tell folks?
All right. So this last segment is our last bit of this whole season. I've compiled some of the most salient quotes from all of the guests that we've had, and we're going to use this hopefully in our Supreme Court case because these are witnesses that are experts who have shown us why voucher schools are hurting public schools so bad. And it's a rather long video, so let's get to it right away, and then we can talk afterwards. Okay, Patty?
Outstanding. Sounds good. Let's take it. Do we have it? I don't have it. Oh, there we go. Yay.
Millions of dollars being siphoned away from our public schools, and kids are getting hurt on a daily basis.
There are so many different things that are a problem with the voucher schools, the lack of accountability, and certainly the fact that they choose the students they want. It's not that parents really can choose a school. The schools get to choose the students. And so students with disabilities, students with behavior issues, students who have additional needs, whether they're English language learning needs, or are different in any way or need additional services, the voucher schools don't have to take them. And in fact, many schools actually actively kind of counsel them out.
Nikki, what's happening? How does the rubber hit the road when we see 70% reimbursement rates for special education moving down to 26 to 30%? What does that mean for schools?
What it means is that kids will not get what they need, because legally you can't cut special education, which means you cut from the general fund. And therefore there goes the math team, there goes the football team, there goes any social programs. And what it does is it's going to contrast kids with disabilities versus kids without. And people are going to say, well, why do we have to fund them? And it will create an absolute war between those who have and those who have not. You have to realize this is not a choice. This isn't school choice. This is a purposeful bankrupting of the education system.
But as of today, as of this budget that was just passed, we still only get reimbursed at approximately 30% compared to the vouchers and charters now with the new budget being reimbursed at like 95%.
The state of Wisconsin has a $4 billion surplus right now.
So it's not as though they can't find the resources or there's no way that they could make these investments, and they have to make hard choices. They're simply choosing not to. I mean, they're simply deciding, at the higher ed level and K-12 level, they're simply deciding that they're not going to invest in these resources and give kids the resources they need.
The U.S. Supreme Court said yes, that if a state funds private schools, it has to also send public funds to religious schools. So a while back, the battle in the courts was about whether a state could fund religious schools at all if it so chose. But now states don't have a choice. If they fund any private schools, they have to fund religious schools.
And those voucher schools get their money first, and whatever's left is kind of divvied up and balanced out throughout the rest of the state of Wisconsin.
No one talks about, or no one has looked at the fact that until very recently, school choice wasn't available anywhere else but Milwaukee. Milwaukee is a city. It's a city that is made up mostly of Black and brown residents. And for some strange reason, and I'm not even going to call this strange. At this point, I don't know if I can call it anything other than racism, but how is it that Milwaukee continuously is underfunded? How are they targeted for these scams and these things?
The people that it hurts the most are the most economically disadvantaged areas, because the general aid formula is to help them keep their property taxes in check based on their poverty. And the more that voucher money is taken out of that general aid, the higher the tax impact is on those communities, which to me is the reverse Robin Hood effect, right? We're taking money from the poor and giving it to the richer, which just doesn't make a lot of sense.
There's no state law that says that students require educators who are certified and trained in all these different areas.
Only in public schools. It's like the Wild West. That's the great mystery of privatization to me, is why anyone would choose to put their child into a system where you literally give up your rights as a parent to be actively engaged in the education of your child. It's only in a public school that you have recourse to the democratically elected officials who you have chosen to serve and represent you. So you can go to your board, you can share your concerns, you can have a say in curricular matters. You don't have any of those things as a parent in a private school, and you don't necessarily even know what kind of teachers are in front of your kids during the day, if those teachers don't have to be fully licensed.
But once the child is enrolled in that private school that's participating in the special needs scholarship program, the parent and the school, the private school people, look over the IEP and they decide what they're going to deliver. They do not have to deliver any of the services that are in the IEP.
But they can take the 15,000.
But they can take the 15,000
until the third Friday. Until the third Friday.
Well, as long as the parent says that what they agree to provide is sufficient. If the parents say, okay with me, then they can take the money without providing any services to the child.
And there's even a term that's emerged, because this is so common, something called pop-up schools, which they open to take advantage of vouchers, and then they shut down after an average of only about 4 years. And we're seeing this borne out, like not just with a couple of anecdotes, but actually with sort of like systematic data.
They had mentioned, hey, we'll take all that administrative cost and the teaching off your plates as a private business. We'll take care of it, and then we will receive that aid. So again, the privatization really impacts us here in Eau Claire. But again, we don't have that control. We don't have that opportunity to influence as well. But again, not to the cost of our public school students here, and really impacting public school students statewide.
I think it's important to mention the data that came out last week too about voucher schools, where they scored, their test scores were significantly lower than the public school districts in Wisconsin. So they're really, this whole idea that the voucher schools are outperforming public schools anyway is nonsense, because sort of objectively they aren't.
And that's not just in Wisconsin, that's everywhere.
Yeah. I didn't want to just bring a lawsuit without actually trying to explain to people, listeners in Chicago, Minneapolis, and obviously everyone that I can possibly reach in Wisconsin. We just don't want to get rid of voucher schools without telling people why they're bad. And And that's what we're doing here today.
What I hear from parents most is, why aren't we investing more in public education? Why aren't we investing in good schools for my kids to be able to attend? I want my kids to be able to have good choices in the public school system. That's what I hear.
There is irreparable harm happening to students every day, and under the guise of creating choice, they've created a cancer on our public schools, and we've got to get rid of it.
And so at the very core of this struggle is a fight for the democracy basics. We want to live in thriving communities. We need thriving public schools. You want thriving public schools? You need to fully invest in making sure that your educators have what they need to do the jobs they're trained to do, then trust them to do it. And then by all means, elect school board members who are going to make sure that they get it and who are going to go to bat for those educators and those kids, and who are going to stand up for policies that work for all of the public schools, not just some of them, not just the haves, right? And we need to come together and say enough is enough. Stop playing politics in our name and stop playing these sick games with our kids.
The Supreme Court of Wisconsin just sent an order to the plaintiffs, in this case, us, and the defendants, which is Robin Voss, the Department of Public Instruction, and the Wisconsin Department of Administration. And they ordered all of us to send in arguments to convince them to take this case immediately. That means, they could have rejected this case outright and said, you have to do it the old-fashioned way, which is to take it in a small court first and then win there or lose there and appeal. But we went straight to the Supreme Court because we think it's that important to Wisconsin to end what's going on here. And so by asking us to actually submit arguments, it means that they are at least willing to entertain to take this case, which means that if we can, it's going to probably skip an entire year of litigation if they take this case right away. Patti, you are on mute, my dear.
What are your thoughts as we wrap up these segments, Kirk? Because a lot of tremendous work and information. Take it away.
Yeah. So that video, just we try to make it as short as possible and also include some of what all of our guests said. And so we created this whole series to create a body of evidence that we could help convince people that the school voucher system in Wisconsin is really hurting public schools. It's not helping kids, it's hurting teachers. So this is our last show, but the fight continues. And we are and we've created, because of you, Patti, and because of WCPT, we were able to create this body of work that we hope to submit to the Supreme Court, and we hope to submit to the people of Wisconsin so that they can understand what's going on here, because it's so complicated. There's so many angles to this. When people hear school choice, they're like, "Yes, I want choice," and that's just a misnomer. And we've just spanked that idea right out of the room over the last 10 weeks.
Yeah. That's the whole point of driving it home. We have been driving this home, and I'm really grateful for all the information. I know Julie's behind the curtain over there. So thank you so much for all of this, for leading the charge on this, and for really, I think, enlightening so many people who this is all background noise for them too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This issue is a death spiral for the public school system. It's meant to undermine the public school system, to enrich people who are trying to get rich off of your tax dollars, and to indoctrinate kids into religious education. And it's happening all over America. We have a chance to stop it in Wisconsin, but it's so hard to get people on board because it's so complicated. So hopefully this will allow some more transparency. And I hope people go to upnorthpodcast.com and listen to the entire series. There's about 10 weeks of this. So I would encourage you to listen to all of our guests and not just this little video snippet, to really learn about this issue.
And as far as the snippets too with the social media, though, I think it's really great to have that as consumable pieces of information as well. So it's all the Minocqua Brewing Company's on your social media. Is that across all platforms?
Yeah, you can see it on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook. We release a little 60-second snippet every day so that people can digest it in little bits, which is really helpful.
Outstanding. And Schoolhouse Bach. Don't forget about that too. I'm excited about that.
We're all about this case as well, because we wanted people to understand, just to see it on shelves and understand that this case is happening.
Thank you so much, Kirk, and all of our guests have been tremendous. Again, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Alejandro, back at the station, and Matt Cummings for making this show possible today. Mike Krutz up next with The Devil's Advocate, and we'll be back tomorrow with another wonderful show. Thank you, everybody.
You're listening to The Right Wing War on Education, brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company.